bill itself, I cannot find the prima facie case of privilege exists in this case. I thank honourable members for their attention. I have notice of a question of privilege from the honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, Ota papista makeo. I rise on a point of privilege of Prima Facie. Nima mechasin ota iea. I am proud to be here. On May 4, 2017, I rose in the House of Commons to speak on important issues of violence being committed against Indigenous women. In order to make a larger impact, it was felt that it would be appropriate to speak in nehiyo, or the Cree language. Even though I had provided documentation to the translation and interpretive services 48 hours prior to my speaking on May 4, 2017, they were unable to provide a time-appropriate translation during member statements under Standing Order 31. It is my belief that my parliamentary privileges have been violated because I could not be understood by my fellow parliamentarians and Canadians viewing the proceedings, thus negating the debate and point which I wish to make. I was effectively silenced, and even though I had the floor and had been duly recognized, my speech was not translated, rendering me silent and thus violating the parliamentary privileges of all MPs present in this chamber. Imagine, for an instance, if a French Canadian spoke in the House, but no translation and interpretive services were provided. It is my belief that parliamentarians have a constitutional protected right to use Indigenous languages in Parliament. Section 35(1) of the Constitution Act 1982 states, "The existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed." Do language rights fall within these provisions? Professor Karen Drake has written about Indigenous language rights in Canada as pre-existing the Canadian state, and these rights have not been extinguished and are still present. Others, like David Leach and Lorena Fontaine, have been working towards launching a constitutional challenge, arguing that under Section 35(1), the federal government has not only a negative obligation not to stifle Aboriginal languages, but a positive obligation to provide the resources necessary to revitalize those languages, Mr. Speaker. Now, the latter claim is perhaps the most challenging, while the former is more straightforward. Though the test for establishing a 35(1) Aboriginal right has ballooned into a labyrinth of steps, sub-steps, and sub-sub-steps, the core of the test has remained relatively consistent since the Supreme Court Canada's decision in Vanderpreet. I quote, "In order to be an Aboriginal right, an activity must be an element of a practice, custom, or tradition integral to the distinctive culture of the Aboriginal group claiming the right," end quote. Many, including myself, argue that Indigenous languages easily meet this test. As Leach puts it, quote, "There is no more distinguishing feature of most cultures than their languages." Other arguments also focus on the inherent connection between language and culture, as illustrated by the way in which Indigenous language structure Indigenous knowledge. An additional nuance can be added to this argument. The Supreme Court of Canada's jurisprudence recognizes that the practices, customs, and traditions protected by Section 35(1) include the law of Aboriginal peoples. At least some Aboriginal languages reflect Aboriginal laws. As Doris Pratt and Harry Bowen explain, our languages are sacred gifts given to us by the Creator. They carry our way of life, our views of the world, our history, our laws, and they bind us to each other, end quote. Thus, at least some Aboriginal languages are integral to their respective cultures, not merely insofar as they reflect those cultures, but also insofar as they reflect the laws that are included within their practices, customs, and traditions protected by Section 35(1). The analysis thus far may support a negative right to be free from government laws prohibiting Aboriginal peoples from speaking Aboriginal languages pursuant to Section 35(1) and Section 52(1) of the Constitution Act 1982. But the real issue is, do Aboriginal peoples have the right to use their own languages at public expense? In other words, do governments have a positive obligation to provide Aboriginal peoples with government services in Aboriginal languages? Commentators have answered this question in the affirmative by appealing to the Supreme Court's jurisprudence on Canada's official languages. According to the majority in Regina versus Bolak in 1999, quote, languages' rights are not negative rights or passive rights. They can only be enjoyed if the means are provided, end quote. Additional arguments in support of a positive language right can be deduced from the Section 35 jurisprudence itself. The Supreme Court has emphasized that the purpose of Section 35 is to promote reconciliation between Aboriginal peoples and non-Aboriginal peoples in Canada. Section 35 should be applied and interpreted in the light of this purpose. Now, after spending 6 years gathering 6,750 statements from residential school survivors and others, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada concluded that reconciliation requires the preservation and revitalization of Aboriginal languages, and issued numerous calls to action on the topic, one of which states the federal government has a responsibility to provide sufficient funds for Aboriginal languages, revitalization and preservation. Language figures prominently in the Commission's analysis because the very purpose of the residential school system was the destruction of Indigenous cultures and language for the sake of assimilating Indigenous peoples into non-Indigenous culture. Children were prohibited from speaking Indigenous languages both inside and outside the classroom. As Leach notes, no other cultural group in Canada has been subject to state-sponsored attempt to eradicate its language. Thus, the case for a positive obligation on governments in this context is compelling. The federal government took active steps to destroy Aboriginal languages, and so reconciliation requires it take active steps to revitalize these languages. Now, Parliament, Mr. Speaker, is to be the representative of the people of Canada and to uphold the highest principles. Today, our government of Canada has stated they support the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, without reservation. Article 13 of UNDRIP states that Indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize and transmit to future generations their languages, and that states shall take effective measures to ensure this right is protected. In December of 2016, the Prime Minister stated he was ready to introduce an Aboriginal Languages Act. Now, why there are no laws specifically protecting or no rules specifically protecting or governing the use of Indigenous languages here in Parliament, Mr. Speaker, it is my belief that since Aboriginal rights are pre-existing, they should be considered a right, which while it has not been exercised nor supported, it is nonetheless still existing. Cree, because it is my Indigenous language, nehiyo, should be considered an official language in the House of Commons. Understanding Order 1, in all cases not provided for thereafter or by other orders of the House, procedural questions shall be decided by the Speaker or the Chair of the Committees of the Whole, whose decisions shall be based on the usages, forms, customs, and precedents of the House of Commons of Canada and on parliamentary tradition in Canada and other jurisdictions, so far as they may be applicable to the House. The use of Indigenous languages like Cree is not foreign to Canada. The parliamentary tradition has multiple examples, and I would like to enumerate a few other examples of the use of Indigenous languages in legislatures in Canada. For instance, the most recent example, the Senate of Canada, provides interpretation and translation services for Inuktitut for Inuit senators. This has been under the visionary leadership of the Honourable Charlie Watts and Serge Joyal. In addition, there are multiple other examples, such as the Northwest Territories Legislative Council, where Indigenous languages have the opportunity for interpretation services. In Manitoba, the Honourable James McKay was on the Assiniboine Council under President Louis Riel, where Michif, Cree, French, English, and Gaelic languages were used. This legislative assembly was integral to the entry of the Red River, modern-day Manitoba, into Confederation. An example of the openness of the time is the Honourable James McKay. He was an Indigenous Métis man of Scottish origin from a Cree nehiyo mother and who spoke many different languages, including Cree in official proceedings of the assemblies where he sat. In an official history prepared by the Manitoba legislature, it is recorded that Indigenous languages were used in official proceedings. James McKay was a member of the Legislative Council of Manitoba, the Upper Manitoba Chamber, and served as its Speaker until 1874. He was then elected to the Legislative Assembly of Manitoba. McKay is known to be very proud of his Indigenous heritage and used Indigenous languages frequently. He was also a member of the Northwest Council. In the second session of the Legislative Assembly of the Assiniboia, from April 26 to May 9th, when discussing the hay privilege, James McKay addressed the Assembly in the Cree nehiyo languages. I hope these usages, customs, forms, and precedents can be considered as you, Mr. Speaker, craft a just and equitable response to my point of privilege concerning the translation and interpretation and the use of Canada's original languages in the People's Chamber, the House of Commons. Mr. President, I am looking for the right to not only use my Indigenous language of nehiyo, Cree, in the proceedings of this House, but the Parliament provide minimal resources so I may participate fully with other members of this chamber in all activities of the House of Commons, and all other members of this House may participate and interact fully with me in this chamber, Mr. Speaker. So takwe akwek ekitwa, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank the honourable member. I thank the honourable member for Winnipeg Centre for raising his question of privilege, and we'll come back to the House with a ruling in due course. Orders of the day.